Hello, I'm Vicky. This is Cat Mum Crafts, and this is the first episode of my new segment, Historical Hooking, or Hooking Historically, or something. Basically, crochet, and I'll talk to you about history. Now, first of all, welcome to all my new friends, and nice to see you to my existing friends. I'm going to be sitting and making granny squares today, while I give you a brief rundown of English history from about 75 BC-ish to 1908, give or take, and trying not to break crockery. So, in roundabout, I've got an itchy nose, I do apologise, 75 BC in England, the Romans landed. Like everyone who's invaded our soggy little country, they came in roundabout Calais. Although there are, for any Americans, Calais is the nearest point on the mainland to mainland Europe. So Calais on the French side, Dover on the English side. And they built a fortification at Dover. They built a fortification somewhere near what is now Norwich. More about that in a minute. They built fortifications in London and, at least that we know of, Lincoln and York, and among other places. In fact, York was a very much favoured place towards the end of the Roman Empire with the Emperor Constantine. So that was in about 75 BC they originally landed. They do have other fortifications, but my brain can't remember where. So they originally built the Alexandra Wall, quite north in Scotland, to keep the Picts out, and who were a Celtic tribe, and another Celtic tribe called the Scotti, which came from Ireland, but that is where the Scottish people got their name. Originally, Scotland was known as Caledonia and England was known as Alba, just in case you're remotely interested. So they built the Alexander Wall initially to keep, which is more towards the Highlands, to keep the Picts and the Scotti out. And then sometime later the Emperor Hadrian built the slightly more famous Hadrian's Wall. Again, same purpose, keep the marauding Celts out. With some degree of success, but not, I should imagine, huge. They did have frontier fortresses knocking around up there as well. So then there was some kind of, they went home again for a bit and reappeared and went home and reappeared and went home and what have you. And there was, from about the year zero, there was more of a continuous Roman presence in Britain, as it was starting to be called, depicting from the name of the peoples, the Bretons, which also linked with the Bretons of what is now Brittany. Round about 60 AD, there was a bit of a revolt from the Iceni Celt tribe of what is now Norfolk in East Anglia, led by a woman called Boudica, or as the Romans called her, Boadicea. Few people might have heard of Boudica, especially if you've watched Horrible Histories. She eventually, in order to evade capture, was reputed to have drank poison. Nobody's quite sure what it is, or was, except death rather than capture. Okay. So there was Roman occupation and roads happening up until about 410, when the Romans went home, presumably because the empire was starting to crumble. There was still, the Britons were an unruly race, and quite frankly the weather's better in Rome. And also, by the time the Roman Empire ended, they had a second hub, as it were, in what became the Byzantine Empire and is cheerfully known as Constantinople, hence Constantine. And Constantine had something to do with York, which off the top of my head I can't remember now. But there's a big statue of him outside York Minster. So I'm assuming it's something to do with his conversion to Christianity. It might have been at York. A little bit fuzzy on that one, I'm afraid. So round about 500-ish, in the middle of what we call the Dark Ages, so-called not because we had lousy weather, we have lousy weather all the time. But it's called the Dark Ages because there is no illumination, no information. We basically don't know. But round about 500, as I say, right smack in the middle of the Dark Ages, there may or may not have been a legendary king, King Arthur. Now, historians agree that if such a person existed, he would have likely have been a Romano-Celtic warlord, so Roman-Celt mixed, and Guinevere was likely to have been an Irish Celt. We think, possibly, but there is no hard and fast proof to this. This is literally the stuff of legend, but historians agree that that is, if he existed, the most likely scenario, and would have been based in Wales, South Wales, North Cornwall. I'm not even going to try and pronounce the Cornish name for the Roman name for Cornwall, even because it's a mouthful. And while I can tell you like the name for York, which is Eberacum, London was Londinium, Norwich was Caister, I can do that. Can't get my mouth round the name for Cornwall, I'm afraid. Sorry, people in Cornwall. But yeah, so they reckon he would have been round about 500 and a Romano-Celtic warlord. Now, sometime around between 500 and 700, possibly more towards the 500 end, because there are tales of him doing battle what? I know, I'm talking. It's history. Listen, you might learn a thing. Sorry, cat. Yeah, there is stories of King Arthur defending the land against the Angles and the Saxons invaders, so they would tie there, but certainly between 500-ish and 700-ish. The land, our soggy little island, was invaded by Germanic Dane type area, the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes. Now the Jutes parked themselves in pretty much Kent, and yes, I am going to have to go what part of Kent, all of it, for those who again watch horrible histories. The Angles parked themselves in East Anglia, hence Angle, and that's also the derivative of England, Angle land. And the Saxons kind of ran about all over everywhere. Now the Angles and the Saxons eventually spread westward to pretty much everything apart from Scotland, Wales and Cornwall, because the peoples at the time were really quite terrifying. We believe the Jutes went home. So round about 700, the British people were cheerfully known, with the exception of the Celts, were pretty cheerfully known as the Anglo-Saxons, which again is where that comes from. And the Vikings invaded, on and off, for about 300 years. Now, at the time of the Viking invasions, England wasn't unified as England. There was Cornwall, there was Wessex, which was pretty much everything from Kent down to Cornwall, and sticking up a bit, so round about Avon and Bristol and all that. Even English geography I'm not very good at, I apologise. There was Mercia, where the capital was Tamworth, near Birmingham. Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and the biggest, by quite some distance, was Northumberland, or Northumbria as it was at the time, which went down from about Leicester as it is now all the way up to Scotland, and went from east to west. A large chunk of that later became Danelaw, so it was where it was land given to the Vikings to settle and farm. And the Vikings came and went, and like everybody who invades from the east, pushed slightly further westwards. Some forays into Cornwall, some forays into Scotland, some forays into Wales. Yeah, so that's the Vikings, and they poddled around for 300 years, give or take. If you wish to know the Anglo-Saxon name for York, because it's the one I've got clearly branded in my brain hole, was Efferwich. So it went Eberacum, Efferwich, and then when the Vikings were running around there, it was Jorvik or Jorvik, which since has translated to York. Now, in 1066, we were invaded. Again, that's my coffee. That's coffee. Don't drink my coffee. By the illegitimate Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror. William of Normandy, and I'm not allowed to say his nickname, but it was the Frenchified version of William, which is Guillaume, and the Frenchified version of illegitimate child. So in 1066, he beat Harold Godwinson at Hastings, well, near Hastings, little field called Senlac Hill, and there is now a village there called Battle, as you do. His rule wasn't entirely straightforward. There were rebellions, as there is with every new thing, but eventually settled down, married a lady called Matilda, and had, that we know of, 3 sons. Robert Curthose, who could have ruled but didn't and was in prison, William II, William Rufus, and Henry, who was Henry I. Now, on Henry I's death in 1138, we had the first of our big civil wars, what was called the Anarchy, because Henry, rather unfortunately, his eldest child, his son, had died in a naval accident off the coast of France. So that left a daughter, Matilda, another Matilda. There's hundreds of Matildas. Matildas everywhere. Now, she was actually named Queen, but her cousin decided to usurp the throne. So there was a big battle until, lots of big battles, civil war until 1153, when Stephen died and Matilda's son Henry II came to the throne. And the country bimbles along peacefully, relatively quietly, until Henry II's youngest son decided to make a right naff up of things. And that was, of course, King John, who you may remember of Robin Hood fame. So in 1215, we had, there was rather a large document which set down rights and rules for the people. Little, slightly famous document called Magna Carta, which is what apparently the American Constitution's based off of. Now, Henry II married a fabulous woman, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had originally been married to the French king. Caused a bit of scandal in Europe. However, their eldest child sadly passed away. Their middle child, you may have heard of him, Richard the Lionheart, and then King John. Useless. And mean with it as well. So then we had a few dodgy rulers and some uprisings, and the occasional on and off war with Scotland. Round about 1306, there was a skirmish, well, several skirmishes, led to the capture of a fairly famous dude, William Wallace, Braveheart. Horrible film, in historical accuracy at least. For the time it's set, there's a much better film called Outlaw King, which is about Robert the Bruce, but it's awfully grisly. But that's an entirely different story. So we had the deposition of one of our top 3 most useless kings, King John being one of them. Edward II being another. He was the one who was supposed to have been executed with a red hot poker up his bottom. Nice. Historians generally tend to agree that that was in fact done after death, and that he was most likely smothered or something. Edward II's son, Edward III, because you know, original naming, decided he wanted to claim back lands in France, courtesy of his mother, who was Isabella of France, who had a right to the throne of France, except the French didn't allow women to rule, this annoying thing called Salic law. So he decided he should have lands in France, or rather his mother decided and quietly persuaded him that he should have the French throne. And the 100 Years' War started, including the famous Battle of Agincourt and battles of Poitiers, Crécy. What? I know, I'm about to mention it. Wins and losses on both sides. Eventually, it kind of faltered to a stalemate when the French sued for peace. So nobody really won, but nobody lost either, except everybody lost because people died. But it kind of officially ended with a treaty which provided for the most terminally useless king we had. Henry VI, the son of Henry V of Agincourt fame, was promised in marriage to the daughter of the Duke of Anjou, Margaret of Anjou. Now, and this is where we get more into areas that I am more secure in. Excuse me, although I am rattling all this off at the top of my head. Where have we got to? Yep, Henry VI. Henry VI was a very peaceable, docile man, and he, at some point, slipped into what can only be described really as catatonia. So the lights were on but nobody was home, and like staff had to physically feed him, change him, clothe him, wash him, etc. So he was deemed unfit to rule, and there was a protectorate given to the Duke of York. And now Henry was of the House of Lancaster, which had taken the throne in 1404, or thereabouts, when Richard II was deposed, but that's an entirely different story. So Henry was from the House of Lancaster. Richard Neville, Duke of York, no, Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, was deemed the nearest available in age of Henry's uncles, and was made Lord Protector, which didn't go down too well with Margaret's wife, who had a child. And from that sprang up the Wars of the Roses, which trundled on from the 1450s to 1485 with the Battle of Bosworth Field, where the Plantagenets were ousted once and for all, and it started the era of the Tudors. That does cover the mystery of the Princes in the Tower, which is, I could do an entire video on its own. Nobody really knows what happened to them, but because they vanished. But the top three contenders to take blame, whether they physically did the act or just ordered it, were Richard III. Now, I'm a staunch Ricardian, so I can't countenance that. Ordered by Henry Tudor's mother, or ordered by the Duke of Buckingham. As I say, I'm a Ricardian, so my vote will always go that it wasn't Richard III. But there is no proof either way, so people can have their opinions on that. But anyway, Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard III was killed and Henry Tudor proclaimed king by conquest, which means king through war, basically. But he solidified his claim to the throne by marrying the last Plantagenet princess, Elizabeth. And there is a whole, again, I can do a separate video on the Wars of the Roses. So they had kiddies, known quite cheerfully as the Tudors. Again, whole video on that, but briefly. So Henry Tudor married Elizabeth of York. They had 4 surviving children. The eldest, Prince Arthur, named for King Arthur, married originally Catherine of Aragon, but died at age 16. Their eldest daughter, Margaret, went to Scotland and married James the IV of Scotland. And had a baby boy called James, who went on to be James V, who was the father of Mary Queen of Scots. Now, briefly, Margaret then remarried after James IV died to a gentleman called, I believe, Archibald Douglas, and they had a little girl, Lady Margaret Douglas. Lady Margaret married a chap whose surname was Lennox, but the title was Darnley. They had a little boy, Henry Lennox, Lord Darnley. Now, bearing in mind, right, so at this point, Henry Darnley and Mary Queen of Scots are cousins. Henry Darnley and Mary Queen of Scots got married and had a baby. James VI of Scotland, James I of England, but that's jumping. So yeah, that was Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's eldest daughter. The middle son was Henry VIII, who divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, and 3 legitimate children and 2 illegitimate children, one of whom he acknowledged because he was a boy, Henry Fitzroy, and one he never acknowledged, but there is strong suspicion. And then Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's youngest daughter, Mary, married first into the throne of France, and then when King Louis died, she married Henry VIII's best mate, Charles Brandon, and they were made the Duke and Duchess of Suffolk. They had a daughter, Frances, who married a chap called Henry Grey, who was distantly related to Edward IV's wife, Elizabeth Grey, or Elizabeth Woodville, as she's more commonly known, because there's a lot of intermarrying goes on. Edward IV being the father of Elizabeth of York, and so Francis Brandon and Henry Grey had a little baby girl called Lady Jane Grey, who ruled for 9 days. Anyway, so Henry VIII, possibly the most famous ruler we've ever had, certainly of that time. Married Catherine of Aragon, had a little girl called Mary, divorced her, married Anne Boleyn, had a little girl called Elizabeth, had her executed. Married Jane Seymour, had a little boy called Edward, she died. And then the other three were divorced, beheaded again, and just died. So then Edward ruled from when he was 9 until he was 16. Staunch Protestant, very scarily extreme Protestant. He died. Queen Jane ruled for 9 days. I call her Queen Jane despite the fact that a lot of people just refer to her as Lady Jane. And then she was removed. And then Queen Mary ruled. Queen Mary was very Catholic and attempted to bring the country back to Catholicism, which was the subject of my dissertation at uni, so I can do a whole talk on that one. Yeah, not terribly successful, burnt a lot of people fled to Europe, not a happy 5 years. She died, Elizabeth took over, yay! And the era of Gloriana occurred. Now, 1603, Elizabeth died. The throne went to her younger Scottish cousin, James VI of Scotland, 1st of England. So that would be the son of Mary Queen of Scots and her cousin. Now, I love Mary Queen of Scots. So, you know, no judgment, marry for policy, but a little too close. Which heralds in the Stuart era and the final of the English Civil Wars, the one cheerfully called the Civil War. That raged from 1642 to 1651. And then we got the crown back after the parliamentarians got soundly ousted. In 1707, England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland were unified. Most of the Irish didn't take too kindly to that, so we got only Northern Ireland. I've just dropped my yarn on the floor. So fast forward a few years through the Jacobite rebellions in the time of George II. I don't really know a huge amount after 1603, so this is just off the top of my head. But the Jacobite rebellion was Bonnie Prince Charlie. 1837 to 1901 we had Queen Victoria and a time of social reform. Victoria died in 1901, and then in 1903 the suffragette movement started, and then women got the vote in 1918. And that, in half an hour, is a very potted version of just shy of 2,000 years of English history. Now, from here on in, I will feature some Greek, a bit of Roman, and predominantly civil wars and uprisings, because that's kind of what I know about quite a lot. I can talk to you an awful lot about the Tudors, the Wars of the Roses, and particularly Queen Mary. But yeah, that's kind of about it, really. World War One, World War Two, all hell's broken loose. It's not shiny times for the last century and a bit, really. But we do have the Beatles and Queen. So you know. So with that, I will make a further list of things to go into more depth with you. I will remind you that I need sleep, or look after yourselves, because if you don't look after yourselves, you can't look after anybody else. And in the immortal words of Bill and Ted, be excellent to one another, and I will see you next time. Bye.